I'm sorry, I'm blanking on whether it was Wellesley or Vassar, and she came to work in New York for the first curator in the Prints and Drawings department at the Metropolitan Museum, Colta Ives. And when she came to work in New York for Colta Ives, she lived in Anne's apartment, shared, she had a room there in the area where Anne had her apartment and studio. She lived there with Anne when she was very young. They became friends, and she inherited a significant part of Anne's estate. Anne left her all the prints, the residual prints, and Mrs. Briskin.
What do you do?
They can hear you.
And it was the source for the catalog that we printed way on back there in like 1984 or something.
She also got a lot of David Rosen's paintings that Anne left David. She was with the Baltimore Museum and then the Smithsonian. She was just sort of the head lady in charge of American art over on the eastern side of the U.S., I guess.
Yeah, she actually was one of the very, very earliest directors of an art museum, female directors of an art museum in the United States, when all the males were, after World War II, were not accessible or available. They were working on those, the reclamation projects and the Monuments Men things. She became the director of the museum in Baltimore, really when there were not very many men. Most of them were in the military. So she was a pioneer there.
Welcome, everyone. It is time to get started. Thank you so much to our host, Margaret Lynne, and to our very special guest, the author, Mae Lamarr. I know we are all so excited and have enjoyed your conversation in advance. And welcome to all of our guests.
It's a pleasure to be here.
It's good to see you. And thanks so much for being with us today, Mae, to talk about your wonderful novel that is so evocative of so many different periods of time here in Alabama, in New York, in Paris. It's just amazing to read the sections of this book that deal with the life of Anne Goldthwait, and it makes you really appreciate how incredibly interesting her life was. So the first thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was, how did you come to know about Goldthwait and her story? What drew you to that? Was it the art, or was it the story itself of the memoirs that she partially wrote?
I'm sure it was the art in houses of the parents and grandparents of my friends when I was growing up. And I had a friend, Ruth Bonham, who had her memoirs that y'all in the early 80s, and she got it and she lent it to me. She says, you need to look and see who this was. And so I came to the museum and looked through y'all's file, and that must have been 20 or 25 years ago. And so I just started my file, but then, commerce got in the way of my novel writing, and I had to do some copywriting and stuff for a long time. And so I didn't get back to it until later on. And I'm incredibly lucky that I have had that time to travel around and find out about her and really dig into her life and see what it was all about. And it was no ordinary life, that's for sure.
So what were your resources beyond that memoir? Because you're so great at setting this wonderful social, cultural environment for her, and where she lived and how she lived and who the people were around her and what kinds of things they did, how they dressed. All of that is so integral to your book. What other sources did you use for that material?
Well, I used a whole lot of newspaper. Newspapers.com is just a wonderful resource for that daily, even if it's not right, you're just seeing what's going on at the time. Yeah. And Anne always seemed to be just riding the crest of all this news things, like she was like Paris when Paris wasn't cool. You know, it was way before. I mean, Gertrude Stein was over there, and Alice B. Toklas, who she was very good friends with. She doesn't write about her much, and Gertrude doesn't write about Anna much, or at all that I could find out. Talking to people, you know, we have a lady here in Montgomery who knew Anne Goldthwait as a child, was a friend of Sally Millsap, her mother, Miss Wood, and Anne were very good friends. And I found out, you know, it was the first time I heard said that Anne Goldthwait was no debutante, and she didn't act like a debutante. She did not. She grew up. If you ever, your childhood, I believe, shapes you. And when Anne was a child, at age 12, you know, she is lost the first of two parents way out in Texas, and has to come back to Montgomery with her siblings to be placed amongst the relatives because they couldn't take, you know, all four of them. And so they were split up. And I happened to know a girl that came to Montgomery as a young teenager whose parents had died and was placed with relatives. And so I kind of got my inspiration for what Anne's growing up was like. Anne says herself that I was always carried a load of melancholy that I could feel tangibly pressing on my heart. And the night, even when I was at a party on some cotton plantation, it was so heavy in my heart. The night was so sad. It was almost unendurable. That's what she wrote about her time in Montgomery.
Yeah.
She was, I think she tried to be a happy camper, but she had a lot that she, a shell was in sort of her own world because she was so different from everybody. Everybody had gone to school together, and the closed society to which she joined, it was hard to let a newcomer in, even if it was your cousin or your second cousin. And
Right.
I think she grew up independent of the thinking in Montgomery at the time. And I think she could not wait to get out of Montgomery and go to New York for art classes, which one of her uncles underwrote for her. But I believe her Aunt Molly Arrington that raised her, along with 8 others in the household, she was really the first to recognize that Anne really could draw. And if not for that, just think of, you know, just one casual mention by her aunt put it in her mind that she could be an artist. And that's why I have this conversation she had with her longtime partner, David Rosen. And he asked her, are you happy? And she says, I'm so happy. I was told I would be, but I just didn't know how happy until you. And he said, when did you decide to become an artist? And she said, when I realized I could be one. And I think that's probably true for anybody that does anything as a youngster or as a young person, or just to be encouraged in that way can change the whole shape of your life. And she was, and her aunt gets all the credit in my mind for pointing that out to her. Now, she was fortunate enough to have an uncle with big
Money.
bucks.
Yeah.
But it didn't last.
And the willingness to bring her to New York and put her in a situation, it was almost as if it was kind of, and we'll get to her in a minute, when Nancy says, you know, I see good things ahead for you. You almost see that developing in your story. One thing I really want to know, though, is how did you come up with the parts of your story that were not in the memoirs, the things that happened to her and the things that she thought and the people she met? What parts of that did you extrapolate from the writing, and what specific episodes did you really adopt into your fictional account?
Well, if you read the first page of her memoir, you'll see that she mentions Nancy Sykes 4 times. And if I was in this, she was in her 70s. And I guess if I were writing a memoir, you put out what's top of mind first. I mean, she was first thing first. This is who I loved so much. This is who gave me a gold ring. This is who, I remember, just being my rock. And so I made up Nancy Sykes to sort of be her lifelong companion, even after she died, because I felt like her presence in Anne's life was paramount to who Anne was. And the fact that she designed and sewed the suffrage banner for the suffrage night in New York City baseball game. It was a big suffrage night, and the suffragettes wore matching outfits that matched Anne's sign. She was very, very much a part of the suffrage movement. And I can see that just dovetailing in with her spirit, she was an individual. I mean, she was just on her own kind of for a while. And when I read under the several of her prints, especially of her dog and stuff, DR and I together, David and I together, I'm thinking, who is this person that I had no idea. Who is this person that she's sketching with? Or who is she allowing to sketch on her sketches? And I found out I just kept looking and looking and realized those two were together for 31 years. Living in the same place with the same telephone and the same dog. I'm like, how much, more do I need? But she really found somebody. I'm not sure how, given the social mores of the time, how much, how dangerous, not dangerous, but socially dangerous that was.
Well, it was Greenwich Village, so it can't have been that socially dangerous.
Yeah. Like for Montgomery, I think there was the end that Montgomery knew, the girl from the big, nice family and everything. And then there was the actual Anne, who was a very vocal suffragette up in, New York, and a very good friend of Gertrude Stein. She said she'd gone to Gertrude's many times. So I pulled Gertrude and her crowd in, because if you went to Gertrude's many times, then she saw everybody. She saw Picasso. I mean, she saw everybody. She saw everybody. And I just thought that was really, really neat. She just kind of had a way of being in the right place at the right time, I guess. And boy, did she labor. She was so true to her work that, she was out there struggling to get a show of her own. And the newspapers on her first professional show just absolutely panned her and said she needed to go back to the hobbyist. And that's what you did if you were a lady painter, but you weren't all that good. And so she just let it go, and she kept working. And finally she gets another one, years later. She's in her 50s, and they're saying, oh, she's real, she's pretty good. She's arrived. And she's thinking, y'all said I arrived 20 years ago when I came from Paris. I had one, she was in the 1913 Armory show that introduced modern art to America. She's in there. And nobody liked modern art. I mean, a lot of the curators, such as yourself, around the country, they just dismissed modern art. They didn't want this modern art, especially a woman modern artist. Mine, that's two strikes against you. And she persevered.
Southern.
She had her own style, though. She was not copying anybody. She was just doing what she wanted to do. And I think a lot of her prints and her work in Alabama was almost like a journalist. She didn't sugarcoat anything. She just did it. She just showed you what she saw. Cotton bales, Bogahoma, which is just a totally cool place. I wish I had been to Bogahoma when it was Bogahoma. It's kind of chopped up now, but it's still a little bit there. But I just went, I talked to a lot of different museum people, a lot of different archives folks, and just kept reading until I felt like I knew, knew what she would have done in any circumstance. And I'm
Yes.
sure I got it wrong some, but I wanted other people to know who this woman was. Cause there was just like a set of descriptions that was the standard lines you would say about Anne Goldthwait. I just wanted to look farther and see what she was really about. And I really would. I'm sorry I didn't ever meet her.
Yeah, I know that I want to go back a little bit to Nancy Sykes too, because she's a really important character in your book, really from the first pages. And I've looked at a lot of work by Anne over the years in both paintings and prints. And when I was reading about Nancy, it really cemented for me the feeling that I got when I looked at the images that she painted of Black people, that it was very much, it wasn't like local color, if you know what I'm saying. It's like she was from the South. She was known as an artist of the South in New York. She depicted a lot of Black people, but she really only depicted them in Alabama. It was as if she came back to Alabama to sort of recharge herself every year, every summer, with an environment that nurtured her and nurtured her soul in some ways. And when you were writing about her relationship with Nancy, especially I loved that scene when you really introduce Anne and Nancy, where Anne is sitting on her lap and she's got her hands on Nancy's hands and Nancy is sewing. And that whole idea of connecting, the idea of making the banner with her relationship with Nancy early on as a tiny child really meant a lot to me. And that all the things that Nancy says and does and her almost mystical presence in the story really draws you into feeling like you understand a little more about the relationship of some white Southerners with Black people in the South, as charged as that has been from time to time. It's a really, truly incredibly powerful relationship that's expressed, and it's expressed really well in your book, I think.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
I did.
So when you start writing about her in New York and what she was doing, learning to etch, I thought that part of her story was really engaging too. And in the memoirs, she does write about learning to etch, and it's a little bit comical the way she writes it when she's talking about the guy who was afraid of women, and this was the guy who had to teach her to etch.
Yeah, and I took that right out of her memoir and just kind of ran with it. And what a funny thing, it's like, don't look at him, or look out. She was looking out the window when he came into the break room or wherever he came in, supply room, and she just acted like she didn't know he was there because he was afraid of women. Why would you be afraid? I mean, why, and then I wondered, like, why was he afraid of women? I had another part that my editor cut out. She said it was not appropriate of why he was afraid of women. And it's just, that I think that firm is probably still in existence.
Wow.
She had the firm name wrong in her memoirs. She, I guess, forgotten their name, or not found out their name, but she and immediately fell in with, coming from Montgomery, as you can imagine how Montgomery was, in the turn of the century, early 1900s. You can imagine the difference between the northern girls up in New York who she lived with and the cousins she left behind in good old Montgomery. I mean, that must have been like total culture shock.
Night and day. Right.
But it was also something that she just, ran with. And her uncle, who actually underwrote her studies, her being the only woman in one of her, her class at the Art Institute, not Art Institute, what is it
Art
called?
Students League.
Art, no, her
The first
Art,
one.
Academy of Design.
Academy of Design.
Yeah. she'd be the only woman in her class, and you know, just went on. You know, it just didn't seem to bother her. You know, I don't think, you know, she wasn't a Mary Cassatt, but she was more of a, she was just her own style, and she just went with it. And I think her work with the suffragist movement, which I think was so very important. I think that was her trying to find some sort of empowerment or something, because everything in her life had been so out of her control. You know, she couldn't help it. And you know, I've looked for a picture of her father, lo these many years. As long as I've been looking into her, I've looked into where is a picture of Richard Goldthwait, the war hero, the mild-mannered war hero, lawyer. Never have found one. And you would think he was successful in Dallas. He was really an up-and-coming lawyer in Dallas, 42 when he dropped dead. And I just can't seem to find, in every instant, I just look through stacks saying, see if there's anybody that looks like a Goldthwait in this thing, and I just can't seem to find one. But can you imagine, she lost both of her parents within about less than 3 years.
Right.
And the cousin came from Montgomery to pick up the kids, and it was at night, and they were, you know, packed a bag and they were on the train. Imagine all the photos and books and papers that were left in that house. I shudder to think of all the things that she lost. Because she was only, you know, she was new 15, not quite 15 perhaps. And she didn't know to gather up things like pictures of her father. I mean, and as far as I can tell, she never painted him from memory. But she adored him. That's what you could see in her writing, how close they were and how much she adored him. But there's a lot of things that she lost. I think one of the reasons that she was so involved in the vote for women was because it was sort of empowering to her. And she had the charisma to pull it off.
Well, and you get the impression from what you write about both her grandfather, George, and her father, Richard, that those were people who played a little bit outside of the norm too, in terms of their political affiliations and their beliefs and how they reacted to the violence of the war and the deprivation and all of that. You can really sense that current in her family of going against the tide, really, when you think back on it and when you see the things that they did, and really the whole Goldthwait clan coming from Boston down into Alabama. You know, it just is it's just a really rich story, and her work is rich in that way to me. It's like, when you look at some of her compositions, there is a wonderful classicism about them, especially a lot of the earlier things that she did that you see in the print work when she was working with David Rosen in Paris. And they went out into the countryside, they went to the gardens, they went down into smaller villages, and they depicted these beautiful scenes of the French countryside. They were very classical, and they, you know, it's as if they are looking together and going, let's do something that looks like a little bit like Rembrandt here. Let's do something that looks a little bit like Daubigny, or, you know, whatever. But then you also know that she has a very distinctive ability to adapt her style to what it is she's working with. In a lot of her later things, her etchings, you see real intense modernism in the linearity of some of the portraits that she did, like Olive, for example. You see her laying on a chaise longue with a cigarette in her hand. You know, there's a real cosmopolitan aspect to this woman that comes through in her art. And you really get that, I think, in the book too, that she is just a little bit of an enigma, but not really, because, you know, she's being true to herself with all of the activity that she undertakes. And I have to say, that's one of the things I really admired about your book, is you were able to put her in those situations where you felt like she was being true to her character, true to her history. And you set it all up for us to understand why that would be the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, George, getting back to George Goldthwait, he was very much against secession. He just thought it was the dumbest thing he'd ever heard. He fought and he spoke, but he was just overpowered by William Lowndes Yancey and the times just overlapped him. And you see him as a politician, because as much as he was against the war, what happens? He gets picked to be the adjutant general of the Confederacy.
Yeah.
And he sends his sons, there to the war. And so he bowed to he bowed to the pressure. But yeah, he was, he grew up in Boston. He went to West Point. He was not a Montgomery, and Montgomery itself was nothing more than a frontier. There were no Montgomeryans when he came to Montgomery. It was just a hodgepodge, mainly of people who had either migrated down or came down to speculate, like Andrew Dexter, and bought up these things. And this was their land now, but of course it had been. I just always like to get in a lesson on this was really not our land.
Right.
We just sort of we whipped the Indians up at Horseshoe Bend, and man, the race was on. And I can't imagine, I think the Native Americans, if anybody has a settle to score, it would be them. And I think every time I pass a casino, I want to go in and, give a few bucks, because I think, imagine if you had your family had been here for 10,000 years, and all of a sudden, sorry, we have sold your homeland to this guy from, up north, and he's going to chop it up into blocks and, sell it as a town. And we're all going to be very civilized now. And but when George got here, and his brothers before him, two brothers before him, Montgomery was nothing but a frontier outpost. And Bogahoma had been here long before Montgomery as an Indian trading post. And so there was such a long history here that it's just hard to even, wrap your head around how old Montgomery really is. We're in the, we're the second phase of inhabitants, I believe. And I just recently read The History of Alabama by Pickens. And you think things are rough now? You should have lived in Alabama when, when the Spaniards came through. It was crazy bad.
Yes.
And Montgomery was no different. It got civilized over time when they brought in women and churches. But in the very start, it was a den of iniquity, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, and another fascinating little snippet was that when George and his circus companions, I loved that part of the book, especially. That was just magical. When they show up to try to come into Montgomery to find George's brothers, how they're met with the burning tar barrels and the people with their faces wrapped in bandanas, because it was they feared, rightly so, yellow fever. There were so many people who came to Alabama, quote unquote, to settle, ended up dying. Women, children, babies. There's such a death toll from yellow fever, malaria, all these diseases that there was no treatment for. So when you think about the people who did survive all that, you knew they had to be, it was pretty hardy stock if they made it through that early settlement period, for sure.
For sure. Well, they were cutting down trees and ginning cotton and everything so quickly that they forgot about disposing of the waste. And they would dig these, hit holes or whatever they were for construction or whatever. And, the mosquitoes were just thick as, whatever. And they didn't know that was how you really got it. They weren't sure. And Yeah, scary time. It was a scary time. I think that when he came in 1824, I believe, or 25, they had 2 summers back to back with it. And it took out about a fifth of the population, which wasn't that high, but it was like 1 in 20 died.
Yeah.
Or something. And it was, and I still don't know where they buried them. I can't find them. They have a couple of mass graves at Oakwood, but I think they've lost track of where all those victims were buried, because the cemetery was one of the first, municipal things we had. We had to.
Yeah.
But
Somewhere.
yeah, they're somewhere in there. I just don't know exactly where.
Right.
But her grave up there, her grave at Oakwood, it's amazing what you can learn when you go to someone's grave. I didn't realize she had a brother that was born before her. His grave is there. Yeah. His grave is there. And, some of her, her family is there, but everybody around there, she's at the very top, which, very top of the hill, where you can see, all of Autauga County, and you can see Elmore County, and you can see a lot of Montgomery. Speaks to the Goldthwaits had a monopoly on the city wharf. They're very early, well-to-do, prominent citizens, and so they got the high ground in Oakwood, which is where she's buried. And I suspect that David Rosen's buried somewhere around there too,
Oh, but really? That's interesting.
Could never find out where they buried him. He had a little bitty funeral service, but burial was never recorded. And so
was the funeral here in Montgomery, or saying in New York?
I was up in New York at like a small funeral parlor. And he was older. He didn't die till 60. And she died 45, I believe, or 44. And I imagine his ashes found their way to Montgomery. I would imagine that, but I don't know. I'm just guessing, and I didn't have a strong enough conviction to act like it. To write it down.
Yeah. Well,
with the rest of my fiction.
Well, yeah, but it makes a lot of sense. When you look at the progression of her work from those early, what we were talking about, sort of the classical kind of influence, to much later, definitely if you look at his work, you see that there was the influence of modernism is there in both of their works. And I think that his work with conservation, I think it probably also maybe influenced the knowledge of materials and all of that. I think you see something of a change in her work later on, maybe and it could have had something to do too with that when she was teaching at the Art Students League, there was probably a lot of absorption of different changes in art and art materials as she went along, because she was, when you think back on it, she was a talented and creative making work artist for a really, really long time. When you think about it, her career was tremendous, and there's so much out there. And while you can look at something and say it's Nan Goldthwait, then you know it because you know her work. It does evolve over time, I think, to a greater level of simplicity. I'm looking at that watercolor that's behind you that we think is South Montgomery County. Yeah, there you go. And I think you see it in that. You were, before we started, you were jokingly saying this is when she only had green paint. And there's a certain kind of that monochromatic approach to it has something to do with a refinement over time, a simplification over time. And you see it, I think, with the etchings as well, the later etchings. You see that same kind of predisposition to simplify things. It's interesting. I saw a great picture of a mule that she made that was an early one. And then when I compared it to a later one, it was interesting that the earlier mule, to me, was more fully developed in terms of its mule-like characteristics than the later. The later one almost was like a little bit of a caricature. And I thought, it's working toward the center. It's working toward simplicity. I think when someone has done as much work as she did over all those years, the tendency is to want to do the reductive thing, really. And she was extremely skilled at that. And I think when you see her work, you really sense how her work developed over time, which is really, really wonderful. And what your book does is really set the stage for why that happened. Where all of her artistic impulse came from, how it's reflected in the way that the experiences that she had, but also the way that she was molded by those experiences and her family. I think that to me is like a really good key element to understanding her creativity, which is really great.
Thanks, Alice. And I also, I think back to Marianne Neely, her talk at the museum a few years ago, when she points out that Anne's trying to tell us that change is coming by adding telephone poles to her work. And she's saying, this is about to change. This is going to change. Here we are. We have electricity now, and it's going to be part of the landscape. And this is part of my landscape are these telephone poles. And I would have never thought of it. Only Marianne could have thought of that.
Yeah. Well, and as knowledgeable as she was about Montgomery and about its development over so many years, absolutely, I think that kind of thing would really stand out to her. And another thing that really fascinates me about Anne's work is her reception in New York. Apart from her involvement with the suffrage movement and her position, she was the president of the American Women's Art Association for several years, and all of her connection to that. The fact that people at that period really appreciated the quality of her work that she made in the South, because she made a lot of work in New York that had nothing to do with the South, but she really became well known for her paintings of the South. And I guess some of that was a little bit related to the kind of, I won't say sympathy, but the kind of sentimental attachment to American history in different parts of the country, and the rural South especially. Some of that probably had to do with that. It's really foreign to urban dwellers, obviously, but it also spoke. The things that I read after she passed away about her work and her reputation really emphasized that I don't think people thought of her work as anything but respectful of the environment, of the region. There is a predisposition to think of the South as poor and untutored and uncultured and all of that. But she really focused on the elements of the South that made it distinctive and admirable, really, for anyone who looked at her work. She was a champion, I think, in that way of the South.
One reason I think she came back every summer is, according to her friend Maddie Wood, is because a lot of folks were out of town. And she didn't have to go to so many cousin lunches at the Blue Moon and stuff like that.
And
she never got any love from our local paper. She got in the ladies section a couple of times for these luncheons that she would have to endure, and she didn't like them at all. And but the Birmingham paper always followed her career. Y'all have those in your files. A lot of those columnists from they followed her career.
Sure.
And Montgomery never did. Montgomery treated her like the cousin has come back, I mean, it's unjust, but I guess sometimes, they say you can't be a philosopher in your own town. You can't be famous in your own town. You have to go somewhere else to be famous. But she just really never got the recognition here. I don't know if it bothered her or not. And she loved her family. Listen, her family pulled her fat out of the fire from day one. And she loved them, but she didn't like so many of the niceties of Southern culture. She didn't like to put on her white gloves and sit at the luncheon table. She just didn't. It wasn't her.
No.
And, now that she'd been, as an older person, she'd been in Paris with Alice B. Toklas. She'd seen it all. Isadora Duncan and Isadora's sister, she were good friends. She'd seen so much. I feel like I just would love to have sat next to her at one of these stuffy cousin luncheons that she had to endure, and just kind of listened to her, or watched her eyes or something.
Watch them roll, for sure.
She had such a broad experience out in the world with these just unique characters. From Harry Weil, I think they pronounce it Weil. He was the curator of the Metropolitan. He said nothing could distract Anne from her love of paint, and her style, like herself, remained young to the end. And, I think that was really true of her. She kind of overcame that initial bad period of the first 15 or 18 years of her life, 19 years of her life, and really made something out of nothing. I mean, she had the backing of her family, but her uncle that underwrote her actually lost his money and died in poverty right before she went to Paris.
Wow.
And so hopefully, and I know her family in Montgomery always continued to support her if she needed it. And so I don't know if Uncle Henry left her a little money, and so she got to go to Paris. There's a story in the Arrington family that somebody had to forego their law school tuition to help Anne with her painting lessons. And so I don't know where the truth lies in that, but
well, it was worthwhile investment if it's true.
But she was just really seriously on her own. But once she teamed up with David, I think things got a lot easier. I think he was very gainfully employed. And she was, she also brought in what money she could. She did book plates and pot boilers and things like that. She did paintings under another name, a male name, to do bird dogs, and because they didn't think, they tried it, so they didn't think people would buy a bird dog from a lady painter or something stupid like that. But she was hustling. She hustled, and.
Well, and we're getting close on to needing to wrap up, but one thing I did want to close with was to talk a little bit about, and this is personal to me, that I loved so much your the scenes with Lucy in the hospital, her sister, because when I first came back to Montgomery as a young curator, I actually met Lucy and her brother, Richard. And I didn't spend very much time with her, but her personality really reflected exactly the kind of personality that you describe in so many ways for Anne too. And that relationship between that really young sister and the older sister, you really felt like she, Lucy, that family characteristic of being independent, outspoken, really going against the tide in many kinds of ways, was very, was sort of the start for, Lucy got her start. She inherited it. I think maybe a certain amount of that from her older sister, because when I read your book, I certainly, in my mind, I picture Lucy and some of her more colorful moments, let's say.
I wanted to structure it so that, Anne is looking back, but and whether she's dreaming or having a results of her medication or whatever. I was trying to give myself some leeway to put fiction in there. Like maybe it was wrong, maybe right. But imagine laying, and she did lay dying for about, I don't know if it's 10 days, really. I mean, she was literally in the hospital dying, even showed that she knew that she was dying before that. But she was, you know, on her bed, in her bed dying. You know, I wonder what she would remember. And I knew that she would remember Nancy Sykes, and I knew that she would, you know, there probably was some angst that went back to Texas when Anne was 14 or 12 and lost her dad. And Lucy was such a little girl. You know, how do you explain that? I mean, how do you cope with that when you can't, you know, help your sister who is 3 or 4 and has imaginary friends? Because how do you relate on that level? And she probably didn't. She probably just said, you know, we're going to Montgomery, let's not talk about it. Or there's nothing we can talk about, or whatever. And so they had to catch up, you know, they had to kind of catch up and tie that bow. On what really happened. And that's my imagination. It's not, I don't know that it happened. I do know Lucy was there when Anne was in the hospital. So.
Well, Mae, it's been wonderful to talk to you. Alice, are you still there? And do we have any questions that people have submitted? Because I'm not actually seeing those.
So yes, we have time for questions. People can unmute themselves if they have a question. I think we may have one question in the chat, which is from Frank Gitcher. And again, everyone, please feel free to ask your questions in the chat or to unmute. But Frank asks, you dedicate the book to Sarah Mae Dozier. She is mentioned briefly in the acknowledgments as seeking the herb life everlasting, but your dedication led me to believe there is so much more to her. Can you comment on this?
Oh yeah. There's a lot to Sarah Mae Dozier. Bless her heart and rest her soul. She was a pretty strong influence on my life. She did a little bit of everything. She was never married, but she was just a very interesting character. And if you wanted to go with her, you would end up either in a graveyard or at an old gold mine or at the archives looking for the lost silver of the Creek Indians or do something like that. And I think she just really influenced me quite a bit. A bit. She chased ghosts. And she was always looking for life everlasting, which is a thing. I mean, I looked it up. It is a thing. I don't know what it looks like, but they used to use it. They used it quite a bit. The Indians did. I think the Indians started it, and it was like prevent colds. I don't know what all it does, but obviously it's quite an herb. And Sarah was always making me help her look for it. And I spent a good amount of time with her as a young teenager and up until she died, actually, a few years back.
Wow.
Okay, can I make a comment, please? Okay. Number one, I'm your neighbor. I live in Media Estates. And I want to tell you, the book was fabulous. You made Anne Goldthwait come alive too. And I'm not a native, but I love her art. But you really made her come alive. And I thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you.
I did.
Yeah.
I have a question, if I may.
Hey, George.
Hi. I'm always interested in the choices a writer makes in composing a book, and especially one based on an actual historical figure. In your acknowledgements, at the end of your acknowledgements, you list the actual people who are real characters and say these are people I've invented dialogue for. You mentioned Nancy Sykes there, but you don't mention the character of Mistletoe, her younger sister. So I'm guessing that Mistletoe was a character of your own invention.
Mistletoe is a character of my own invention. I felt like there was so much heartbreak during this time, and I just wanted to play. I wanted to show it, and I wanted to show the frontier nature of Alabama at the time when there were people leasing lands from Indians, treaties coming up that went bust and people went bankrupt. And if the planter goes bankrupt, all of his slaves go bankrupt. And the insidious nature of, owning other people and how that played out. And, Nancy Sykes remained with the Goldthwaits. She was not a slave. She was probably one before they were emancipated, but she didn't have anybody else but Mistletoe. And I just put her in there because I wanted to show that darker side of Alabama and the territory, because there was considerable darker sides, and it wasn't all mint juleps and magnolia leaves.
Mhm. Okay, yeah, I was going to ask you why you chose to introduce her into the narrative, but I suspected that was the reason. And it's interesting that Anne, no matter how much she tries, can never really bond with Mistletoe. Mistletoe is having none of it because of the way she was so brutally treated.
I don't blame Mistletoe. I mean, she'd had enough. She wanted to be by herself. She wanted some, peace. And that I made that up. That's nothing that now I do read quite a bit, and also historical novels and things. And she was just somebody that had given up and didn't want any more friends, especially
Right.
white.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that the letter that was left for her, and she asked what's in the envelope, and Nancy says hope. So that's what she found in the end, was the peace that was the result of her hope, I guess.
Now there were slaves that were kept long after the war, and that is a true part of American history, unfortunately, and that were never emancipated, didn't find out about it, or their owners didn't let them know. And so she was part of that, and part of the caught up in the financial drama that was slavery.
Yeah.
She was just unlucky, and I just felt like expressing that part while I was having fun with Anne, in Paris, whatever, New York and all that.
Right. It's very important. That whole era in American history, I think, there's been so much mythology about what happened or didn't happen in the South after the Civil War, that now we're just coming to terms with what's actually in the historical record and can be articulated from that record, that's just been ignored for a long time. So, and this book kind of takes you can see that you take advantage of a lot of original resource material that isn't generally in history textbooks that were taught in the early part of the 20th century, or even into the latter part of the 20th century. So it's all valuable, and having it appear as part of the life of an actual character. Mae, the other thing that occurred to me while I was reading this book is this would make a great play, I think. Have you ever thought about writing a play?
I've never tried one. I've done a lot of TV and radio and stuff. I've never done a lengthy play of any kind. No.
Well, it divides up wonderfully into various acts. I'll just put it that way. All right. Well, listen, do we have any other questions today? If not, I'm going to say thank you again so much for joining us today to talk about gifts. It is really a wonderful book, and the way that you focus on her life as a life and put the art in there, I think is really a gift. Thank you again for doing this today. We appreciate you.
Thank you. Thanks, Margaret Lynne. I really appreciate being with y'all. Thanks for having me.
And
Absolutely.
Beverly Bennett says wonderful reading, and we do thank you, and you too, Margaret Lynne. And as I sat with the book, found it so interesting how much you focused on her family and her childhood in terms of shaping what really makes an artist, that in your own connection to that story as someone from Montgomery. So I think we all just loved it, loved having you. Thank you very much. We have another comment from Donna Pickens. Just thanks for a wonderful presentation.
Oh, great. I enjoyed it very much. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks for joining us, guys. We appreciate having you today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, I really enjoyed the book. Wanted to tell you, thank you. Hope to see you on, this is Ann.
Oh, hey, Ann.
Yeah, we'll talk
Hi
about
there.
life everlasting sometime, okay?
Okay.
I got some suspects for it, okay? I like looking at medical herbs, okay?
All right. All right, we'll do it.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.